Welcome to Veterans Voices UK, the podcast where we bring you the remarkable stories of British military veterans from across the generations. In each episode you'll hear the voices of those who served our country, from the heroes of World War II to those who fought in more recent conflicts. But these aren't just war stories, they're stories of life and the lasting impact that service has on those who lived through it. I'm Matt Lim, and today I'm honoured to share an episode I recorded with Steve Bonde at his home in Lincolnshire. Like so many, Steve was conscripted into national service, yet, unlike many, he embraced his time in uniform, as he credits the experience and particularly the skills he learned as having shaped his successful career with the Foreign Office. In this episode, we'll hear about Steve's early life, including how his christening was interrupted by the announcement of World War II from the Prime Minister, Mr. Chamberlain. We'll also learn how his father joined the army, hoping, in his own words, to get a rest from work and the Home Guard. Then we'll follow Steve's journey from his early abilities to learn languages, a skill that would take him to the inner German border at the very height of the Cold War in the early 1960s. But national service is just one chapter of Steve's incredible life. He later travels from the remote regions of Africa to the Middle East, to the very heart of Russia, all as part of a distinguished career serving in the Foreign Office. So thank you for listening to Veterans Voices UK. Now let's hear from Steve Bonde, beginning with that unique spelling of his name.
Oh, you mean Bond with an E? That is unusual in this country. We've done some research, and as far as I know, we amount exactly to myself, my daughter down in London, and my son-in-law, who merged his name with Bond, and my two grandchildren. And that is it in this country. But I believe that it is quite common in Scandinavia, particularly Norway and Denmark, and indeed a few years ago there was a Mr. Bond with an E who was the Danish Prime Minister. I was born in a place which few people have ever heard of. It's a place called Withensea, tiny little village on the east coast of Yorkshire, down near the Humber. It really is the end of the line. Surprisingly, it is still unchanged 85 years later. I was there recently and literally nothing much has changed. I was born on the 14th of August 1939, which has some significance, which I'll come to later. My dad, he was a baker, mostly baking bread and items like that. And my mum was quite literally a skivvy, and proud of it. She skivvied for one of the local well-to-do families. I was christened 3 weeks later, on the 3rd of September 1939. It turned out to be quite a significant day, because just as I tied my christening cap on at 11 o'clock on that Sunday, Mr. Chamberlain was broadcasting on the radio that war had just been declared. And I was somewhat peeved when everyone rushed out of the church to listen to him. Going back to the significance of the 14th of August, had I been born, literally, again, 3 weeks later on the 3rd of September, I would not have been liable for national service. That was the cut-off date. There are a few of us left now. I am over 85, and I was literally one of the last to go in. I have very few memories of Withensea. My dad was, as I said, a baker by day, but in the evenings, after war was declared, and during the emergency of possible invasion, he joined the local defence volunteers, later the Dad's Army, patrolling the beaches of Withensea at night. I don't know how he did it. He was working during the day and he was up most of the night. And in 1943, he actually joined the army, as he told me, for a rest. He trained at Ludlow in Shropshire, and one of my very earliest memories is of my mother taking me on the train to Ludlow to see him just after he'd passed out basic training. And I still have memories of how packed those trains were. People moving from one place to another, servicemen with all their gear, their kit bags and weapons, and above all, the Women's Voluntary Services handing out jam jars of tea to us all. It's still a vivid memory. My father was eventually sent to India and Burma, where he rose to the dizzy heights of Staff Sergeant. He never spoke about his experiences there, and he never applied for his medals. Indeed, he refused to apply for his medals. Next time I saw him was in 1946. During that time, we had moved from Withensea when the invasion was safely over. We then moved to Hull, just in time for the bombing. The earliest memories I have are of the bombing of Hull. Hull was the most heavily bombed city in Britain. London had more bombs, obviously, because it was bigger. Liverpool certainly was bombed, but Hull had the bad luck to be sighted on the flight path from Europe to all the inner industrial cities of Britain: Leeds, Halifax, Bradford, Sheffield. The bombers used to come up the Humber. They used it as a navigation aid, and they would pass over, bomb those cities, and if they had any left, they would drop them on Hull on the way back. I remember my mother and I cowering under the staircase in the gas cupboard, listening to the bombs coming down. Later, when they were built, we moved into the shelters which were built up and down the local street. And I remember crawling on hands and knees out to the entrance of the shelter, peering up between the legs of the ARP warden there, and seeing all the searchlights and the ack-ack, and actually seeing a German bomber being hit and coming down. I also remember an air mine dropping. Now these were specially devised so that they'd exploded at about rooftop level rather than diving into the earth and the effect being somewhat muffled. You got the maximum blast impact, and this one exploded about 2 miles away. My aunt lived about 2 miles away. It was in that direction. So again, another early memory was my mother pushing me into a wheelchair and rushing the mile distance to see if my aunt was all right. Thank God she was. It was a good life growing up. Other relatives who'd served in the armed forces gradually came back. My granddad, of course, he had served long before. He served in the Boer War and then later in World War I as a colour sergeant. I never actually met him, but I do know he was in the Yorkshire regiment. One of my uncles, I had 2 uncles, he served in the Royal Navy on the Arctic convoys, and like my father, he never spoke about it. Another uncle was captured at Dunkirk. He was in the Royal Armoured Corps, captured at Dunkirk and served out nearly 6 years in a Polish coal mine. He died when he was 50. I say, I had a good life growing up. I used to play with dozens of other children in the back streets of Hull, except between 6:45 at night and 7 o'clock when we all rushed indoors to listen to Dick Barton. No one worried us or bothered us. We were completely free to do what we wanted. We wandered off anywhere, anytime. At the age of 12 and 13, I was cycling from Hull to Bridlington, 30 miles away, even up to Scarborough, 50 miles away. But then, of course, we didn't have the weight of traffic then. In the school, I passed the scholarship and went to Hull Grammar School, a famous old grammar school going back to the 14th century. Sadly, it's no longer there. It did not survive comprehensive education. So at school, obviously, we're looking forward to what I was going to do after school. Now, Hull was a major fishing port, a major dock in the country. So the main jobs were either on the fish docks, or in fishing itself as trawlers, or as in the merchant navy. My first choice was the merchant navy, and I even took the various tests, and my eyesight was absolutely 20/20. But as time went on at school, I started to learn languages and found I had some talent at it, and indeed finally passed out at GC O-levels with French, German and Latin and other subjects, as a result of which the Foreign Office gradually became more and more attractive. When I was 15, I passed the Foreign Office Civil Service exam with 7 O-levels, and 6 months later I was eventually invited to go down. I spent those 6 months, I filled them in as a rent collector at 16 years old. The pay was £2 a week, but compare that with the rents of 5 shillings a week. So 6 months later, the exciting news that they wanted me, so my dad took me down to Greenwich, where he installed me in a civil service hospital. Boy, were they exciting times to be in London. I started in February 1956, young, gauche, with a thick Yorkshire accent, and I started to explore places I'd only ever heard of. Wembley, the big football clubs, Piccadilly Circus, Trafalgar Square, Parliament, the Underground, and above all, exciting new experiences. London in those days was a wild with skiffle, coffee bars and pubs and Carnaby Street, and I had my first beer there, and eventually I spent 4 years in Chelsea, which was really wild. And of course the 2 eventual passages of life. My first cigarette, when I was 18, I went in and bought 5 Woodbines. I lit one up, I got halfway through it, I thought, this is awful, spat it out. I destroyed the other 4. I've never looked at them since.
After 4 impactful years working at the Foreign Office, whilst immersed in the vibrant culture of late 1950s London, a stark contrast to his roots and home in Yorkshire, Steve received his call-up papers. It was time to leave the city behind and embark on the next chapter, as reported for his national service.
I remember it was a date, was it 21st of April 1960? Like many other civil servants, I was inducted into the Royal Army Pay Corps. We all remember, dozens of us, tumbling off a train at Devizes. We were met by a corporal, bundled into an RL lorry, bundled out again as we arrived into the barracks, straight into kitting out. We took all that lot to the Spider for the billet. There we all changed into uniform. There we all wrapped up our civic clothing into parcels, addressed them to our parents. They were taken away. We were then led off to be fed, then sent to bed. You were in the army. While I was in the Foreign Office, I was waiting, obviously, to be called up for national service. One of the advantages of being in the Foreign Office is that I was succeeding to a long progression of predecessors who had been in the national service, gone back to the Foreign Office, and they had all done the Russian course there. And they told me all about it and give me all the details, etc., as to how to apply for it. So, on the first week, Major came around asking each of us conscripts what we wanted to do while we were in the army, and most of us said, get out. But I said, I know exactly what I want to do. I want to learn Russian, and the next Russian course starts at Beaconsfield on such and such a date in September. Can you fix it? This Major had never even heard of it. But, good to his word, he went away, and 6 weeks later, I got my posting to Beaconsfield to learn Russian. After basic training then, I joined the Russian course at the Royal Army Education Corps at Beaconsfield, and I spent there 6 months learning Russian with a heavy military accent, obviously, but in that 6 months they took us up from nothing to degree standard. We were so good that after about 4 months of this, they told us on a Friday evening that we would be doing our GCE A-levels the following Monday. Now, we hadn't done any Russian literature, but they gave us English translations of Turgenev's Fathers and Sons, and we rattled through that over the weekend. We then took the A-level, GCE A-level, Cambridge, on the Monday morning, and we all got 94, 96, 95%. That's just with no preparation. We were then sent to GCHQ in Cheltenham, where we were taught how to transfer language ability to military purposes, much more military jargon and vocabulary, etc., and what to do with it on radios and so on. After that, we were posted in transit. We spent 3 nights at the Intelligence Corps basic camp at Maresfield, where we spent all 3 nights there on guard duty, as is the norm. Any visitors get the guard duty. And I got my Intelligence Corps flashes. So after 3 days, we flew to Germany, to 13 Signals Regiment in Bergelin, up near the Dutch border. As we went in through the gates with our kit bags and all the rest of it, and proceeded past the gate room, a voice bellowed at us from across the square, "Get those flashes off." Those are Intelligence Corps flashes. We immediately had to put on Royal Signals flashes. We were not supposed to be there. So for the rest of my national service, I wore Jimmy in my cap badge. Bergelin was not a happy place. Unfortunately, had a bit of a martinet as a colonel, and it was all parades, guard duties. But we did have a signals squadron out on permanent manoeuvre, which we manned. And eventually, I was posted to there. Now, this squadron was based at a place called Langerleben, which is right on the old East-West German border, near the major crossing point into East Germany. And it was up on a hill in the Harz Mountains, with the East German border about half a mile away, and we could look down over East Germany. Wonderful place where we did what we did, which was sit there with radio intercept, listening to what was going on. He was much more professional there, and as a result of which, it was much easier, and it's much more important that we did our job properly, which we did. We spent long hours there, and everything we did was absolutely top secret. One of the things he did give us, though, while I was there, I took every opportunity to get out. So we had a 4-day shift pattern. So every 4 days, I would be off down to the local station with a military ID card, free rail travel. And then it'd be off to Bavaria, the Black Forest, Berlin, on the military cross-swords train to see the sights and to improve my German. And eventually, my German got so good, I was so proud of it. I was sitting one day at a coffee bar on the Fürstendamm in Berlin, and a little old lady staggered up to me and asked me, darf ich mit Ihnen besetzen, bitte? And I said, ja, natürlich, bitte schön. And we got chatting, and after about half an hour or so of this, she turned to me puzzled and says, "You're not German, are you?" I was so proud.
So Steve, I mean, that is quite a speedy thing from leaving home, rural Yorkshire. We end up in Greenwich, we end up in Chelsea, we live in the absolute high life, and 10 minutes later, a Russian course and into Germany. I mean, but the Russian course, if you went from basically no Russian speaking in a matter of months to being fluent, that must have been a fairly intensive course.
It was indeed. Indeed, I still remember the first day when we first assembled and we had the introduction, and then went straight into lessons, and the teacher wrote the Russian Cyrillic alphabet up on the board with the Latin equivalents. And he said, "There you are, I'll give you 40 minutes, then I'll come back, and then I'll test you." This was in the army. You did what you were told. 40 minutes later, we literally knew that alphabet. Every night, well, we started at 9 o'clock in the morning, finished at 5 o'clock in the evening with 1 hour break for lunch. Then we had homework back in the billet. That homework was written exercises, but also every night at least 100, 120, 150 words of vocabulary every night. And eventually, we turned out, when we finally passed out, we were coming out with 3,500 words of vocabulary. A lot of them quite military as well. Hardly knew the meaning in English, let alone in Russian. So that was very intensive course, and this was 5 days a week, 40 hours a week, plus, as I say, homework.
But that is unbelievable. 3,500 words of Russian you've learnt on the course. I mean, I remember once being quoted that if you can learn 800 to about 1,000 words, you're fairly prolific in any language. So you must have, in a relatively short time, been absolutely unbelievable in Russian.
I believe that, in ordinary life, people normally get by on about 1,200, 1,500 words. That's more than enough to get by in real life. A more educated person who's perhaps, had gone on to university, has probably got 2,000 to 2,500. But 3.5 is enormous. And this is on top of this. We were doing guard duties as well. There's nothing like being the peace and quiet of 2 o'clock in the morning for learning hard Russian verbs. One other distraction while we were there was that Beaconsfield was, and I think possibly still is, was a base for Elstree Film Studios. And it's not at all unusual to be marching down the road and you see a detachment of Nazi troops coming the other way. Wander onto a film scene.
So on the back of the Russian course then, we're out, we have the pause where we go to the intelligence corps headquarters, we get cap badge the intelligence corps, we're off to Germany, and the intelligence corps ripped off us because we're not really there. And I mean, did you appreciate it at the time, Steve, that this is the height of the Cold War? I mean, you know, the Cuban Missile Crisis is almost immediately after this. The Berlin Wall must have only been up a matter of months before. Did you fully appreciate what was happening in the wider world at that time?
Absolutely, because, one of the first things I did when I eventually got over to Langerleben was to go into Berlin. It'd been a big ambition all my time. And got on a military train, and train used to go across the border and stop on the other side of the border in a place called Magdeburg, where all the paperwork was done. So while the officers were on the platform dickering with the Soviet officers about the paperwork and so on, all we squaddies on the train, we'd be on the other side talking or bartering with the Russian squaddies who were guarding, checking that nobody got on or got off the train. And there was a massive trade between us. They were giving us their cap badges and belt badges and such like, and we were giving them condoms and chocolates and things like that. So that was the first experience of East Germany. We then got into Berlin, and when I arrived, the Berlin Wall had only just been built. And one of the first things I did naturally was go down to the Brandenburg Gate to have a look. I was in uniform, so there was a perimeter where the military were preventing any German civilians coming anywhere near within about half a mile of the Brandenburg Gate. But I was in uniform, so it allowed me through. Got up quite close. And they were still building it because, the first one they did rushed up. So eventually they improved on it to the horror that they developed later on. And while I was there, they were there building the wall brick by brick by brick. And the intelligence corps, they were there as well, about 3 feet away. And they were building a little observation post, brick by brick by brick. As they put a brick on, we'd put a brick on. And we were going as high as they did. And I was watching that going on. But the atmosphere was absolutely electric. You had checkpoint Charlie, you had tanks literally muzzle to muzzle. The air crackled. It felt a great time to be alive. I've never felt so alive as at that time. It was brilliant.
Even with all the excitement Berlin and Germany had to offer, daily life in the barracks held a world of its own. So I asked Steve about his routines and responsibilities that filled his days as a national serviceman, and what were his daily tasks immersed in the structure and the discipline of his new army life.
It had a curious shift pattern in that we started off at midday on one day, worked through to about 8 o'clock in the evening, off, relieved, then did a night shift to about 6 o'clock, relieved again, back on again, and so on. And as a result of which, we worked our way in 4 days round the clock, which very exhausting at the time, but actually gave you an awful lot of freedom because you didn't sleep all that long. And you got into the routine of it, and the joy of it was you had 3 days off in every 7. What we did, we were sitting listening there, hunched over 2 radios, 2 tape recorders, and there were 35 of us packed into this small wooden hut known as the smoke pit. Every one of them were puffing on cigarettes because he was just puffed. It was intense, constantly just puff, 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 puff. I never did. I was so an exception that he could cut the air with a knife, and he did. You always, when you came up to the door of it was always closed because of security. But when you're coming up to the door from the outside, you could see the smoke coming through the keyhole. So it was an experience. And
you were literally just sat there with a headset on, listening to these radios and transcribing the Russian day and night.
yeah, we had the Morse operators. They did not know Russian. They were just writing it down in Russian, but they had no idea what it was. Every now and again, we'd get a yell from one of them, voice up. So we'd go over, whoever it was at the other end, they'd stopped doing Morse code. They'd moved into voice. So they asked, we came over to continue the log, but we were logging it verbatim. It was an amazing place, amazing atmosphere. And one of the main jobs every night, the night shift, about 3 o'clock in the morning, 2 or 3 of us would be peeled off to go to the cookhouse, where the cooks would have left us an enormous block of cheddar cheese and a mountain of bread. And it was our job to make a huge bucket of tea, army tea, about 1,000 cheese-ons, which we would take back with us, and everybody would fall on. That was always a passage of right kind of night. Wonderful, wonderful. But like I say, while I was in Berlin, we were warned not to go anywhere near the East Zone or go through any of the checkpoints. And indeed, even in West Germany itself, be careful, because the Soviets knew vaguely what we were doing. And so we had to be very, very careful. All that changed, could have changed, might have changed, when one day the chap in the next bed to me at Langerleben, he went off to Berlin on a 48-hour pass, never came back. He'd gone over the wall. Well, of course, he met lots of friends that took him out, wine and dine, and pump him, and he told them God knows what, but obviously blew our covers. So about some dozen years later, he was spat back over the wall, where he met a whole new set of friends for interrogation. But we know he blew our covers because shortly afterwards, this was on Christmas Eve, we were sitting listening to the radios, listening to the Russian coming through, and all of a sudden it broke into English, saying, we would like to wish all our listeners a very happy Christmas and New Year's. While I was at Langerleben, I was obviously impatient for D-Mob. I was due to come out in February 1962. Literally just 2 weeks beforehand, I was told I was going to have to do an extra 6 months. Sadly, Mr. Profumo, the Defence Secretary at the time, obviously had his eye on the wrong kind of figures, and they were running out of sufficient numbers of regulars joining the army, so that we poor national servicemen who were still stuck in there had to do an extra 6 months. Fortunately, after some bullying by MPs in Parliament, the government graciously agreed that we should at least get regular pay for those 6 months. I've never been so rich. But I used to have, all during my service, a chart up on the wall known as a chuff chart, where you used to strike off the days to D-Mob. And I had to put an extra 6 months extension onto the top of that. Eventually, I got out on the 10th of October 62. I was discharged from National Service. Myself and a colleague of mine from Langerleben, both came out together. We were discharged from Germany. We moved, took the train from Langerleben back to Dusseldorf, where we were formally discharged, handed in our uniforms, all the other rubbish and so on, kit bags, mess tins, you name it. I kept my army belt, and I still got that. And it saddens me every now and again to try that belt around me, and it's at least 9 inches too short. So we demobbed from there. They drove us out to the military airport at Dusseldorf, where we flew back to England. and got on the train and went home, see my mum and dad. And I spent about 2 to 3 weeks there.
With national service behind him, despite the unexpected extension, and after a brief period of leave, it was time for Steve to return to the Foreign Office. But where would he find himself assigned now? Would London still hold the same excitement and vibrancy that it had before? And would his role in the Foreign Office feel different?
Foreign Office then, and still even now, is spread all over London, different buildings like the Ministry of Defence and so on. And when I was first time I was in the Foreign Office and before the army, I was in just off the Mall in Carlton House Terrace. We had a wonderful view of all the processions up and down. And then, oddly enough, when I went back to again on the Mall, but a different building, where I was working on the supply and servicing of all diplomatic service cars in this country and in the embassies abroad. Basically killing time until the Foreign Office posted me abroad. By now I was 23 years old and ready to go, and fretting, quite frankly, and badgering the Foreign Office all the time. Surprisingly, or perhaps not surprisingly, the fact that I now knew Russian seemed to make little impact at all on the Foreign Office. So I was stuck in an admin job waiting. The only real excitement at the time was the Profumo scandal. After all the tenseness, the meaning of what we were doing in the army, you did feel that you were doing an essential job. Got back to London. London had changed. It was no longer, Britain, etc., Carnaby Street. It was no longer that. It was a bit more serious. Game back to hostels, as I'd been before, in bed sits. I could still carry all my possessions in one carry-all at the age of 23. I eventually met a girl whom I eventually married 12 months later. And then 6 months after we moved into a bedsit in Victoria, finally came the posting to Tehran. So much for my Russian. So finally, off we went, the romantic route. My bride and I climbed on the Golden Arrow at Victoria Station, crossed to Paris, where we got onto the Orient Express, and there we took time out for 4 or 5 days in Venice. There, a cruise across to Alexandria, a couple of days where I met an old chum of mine in the embassy in Cairo. And from there we sailed up to Beirut and took an aeroplane to Tehran. The new Mrs. Bonde was out of her mind over this. Don't forget, this was just after From Russia with Love hit the screens. So we arrived in Tehran, and that first night I learnt my first bit of Arabic when I looked at the telephone numbers on the telephone, which were in Arabic numerals, and I learned what the numerals were. That was my first bit of Arabic.
You must have had an amazing life after your time in national service. I mean, was there any benefit of learning that Russian course when we went back there? I mean, did you actually eventually get to anywhere near Moscow or Russian speaking, or use that skill you learnt in your national service at all?
That Russian course was the making of me in many, many ways. It gave me a focus. It opened up, eventually, doors in the Foreign Office. Eventually they recognised it. And it provided the pivot to the rest of my career, because about 6 or 7 years after coming back into the Foreign Office from the Army, the Foreign Office recognised that obviously I could do a hard language. Then they sent me on an Arabic course. So if I hadn't done the Russian, I don't think I would have done the Arabic. So that opened up then for me areas of specialisation, both in Soviet Union and the whole of the Arab world. And eventually I've been in pretty well every other Arab country there is. One of the sadder experiences we had was learning Arabic just above Beirut. We are literally above Beirut in a little village, and we could look down on Beirut airport. And it was quite sad to see the state, because by then there were so many refugees in the country, Palestinian refugees, big camp of them around just near the airport, and have these Israeli jets bombing over every other day. I mean, one horrendous time while we were there, a civil war broke out between the Fedayeen, the armed Palestinians, and the Lebanese army, who were trying to keep them under control. And the Fedayeen, who resented this, they wanted to have a go at the Israelis, and the Lebanese didn't want it because that stirred up the Israelis, as we are seeing today, and Lebanon gets to pounding. And there was a British school, literally between a Lebanese army camp and the Palestinian refugee camp. And my daughter, then aged 8, was at that school, and one day it all erupted, and there were shells flying backwards and forwards between the two camps, and several of them literally went through the school. And it was up to us, students up in the hills, to go down with our halting Arabic and negotiate a truce between the two sides while we could get our kids out of that school. They never went back to it for obvious reasons, and about a term later we had to wave goodbye, or my wife had to take our daughter back to school in England, to boarding school, and she never left boarding school until she was 18. Other aspects of the fighting, we were up in the mountains, and there was Fedayeen everywhere, checkpoints everywhere, and you would arrive in a car at a checkpoint, and there's nothing like getting your Arabic right first time is when a Kalashnikov comes through your side window. You make sure you get your Arabic right first time. Also, at one point, as part of the course, we were all told to disappear off away from the school, to Egypt, into Jordan, Syria, wherever, and immerse oneself in the Arabic, improve the oral Arabic, which is what we did for 2 weeks. And on the way back, as arranged, I had my own car, so I picked up a colleague of mine in Damascus for the trip back over the border into Lebanon. While we'd been away, fighting had broken out again, and the Lebanese border was sealed. And we got to the border and told Khartoum, we haven't got a pass. We need a special permission. So went back to Damascus and made a nuisance of ourselves at the Ministry of Interior, and in our best Arabic explained the situation, and could we have a pass, please? And the Minister of Interior was so impressed. These English blokes speaking Arabic, he gave us one. So off we set, back to the border, and I happened to have a Union Jack with me, so I draped it over the bonnet of the car, and the guard on the Syrian side, you bloody idiots. But you gonna go, you go. So off we went, very gingerly, very carefully, very slowly, across this half mile, and finally got to the other side, where a Lebanese captain met us and says, you bloody idiots. Wait here to explain. And eventually got back home, realised just what we'd done.
So, Steve, it's just unbelievable that, I meet national servicemen that come back from national service, and as you quoted earlier, all they ever wanted during national service was to get out. Yet you've come back with this qualification. It may not have been recognised straight away, but eventually, a fluent Russian speaker and then on to be an Arab speaker.
You must have had an unbelievable career after that. I mean, have you got a few highlights that you could share with us that that you did during your time with the Foreign Office?
Well, I could keep you here all night talking about experiences, because the two areas I was in, which was consular and commercial, you were dealing with the public, and which leads to all kinds of events and experiences and activities. I mean, in my first major posting really was Khartoum. After learning the Arabic, was Khartoum, and there I was the commercial attaché, basically looking out for commercial opportunities for British industry, British employment, whatever, etc., etc. And but beyond that, obviously, Khartoum was just one place. Sudan is a huge country now with a huge population. And so every now and again, members of the embassy used to go out, 2 or 3 of them, in a Land Rover, showing the flag. And I remember one time we went all the way up the Nile, almost up to the Egyptian border. And while we were there, we stumbled across an excavation site where there was an Italian archaeologist digging, and miles from anywhere, and she was so thrilled to meet us that she said, "Oh, you must come and have breakfast." So we did, and it was especially for us this, because we were English. She gave us cornflakes, lovely, with the milk, lovely. Then she broke a fried egg into it, and as you put your spoon into the yolk of the egg, it dribbled through the cornflakes. Another one where we basically ate for Queen and Country. We went down to Wad Medni, which is about 30 miles south of Khartoum, and it had been the headquarters of the British Army in Sudan in those days, and was then, probably as is now, still the headquarters of the Sudanese army. And we went down there, and we called on them as a courtesy, and they invited us into the billet and so forth and so on. It was just as the British Army had left it about 10 years earlier. So that went in the officers' mess, and there were all the billiard tables, the snooker tables. Didn't play pool, the snooker tables. And we'd have a go. So we potted off, and the ball hit the cushion with a dead thud. In the years that had gone by, that the rubber had hardened to concrete. There was no bounce in it whatsoever. We have always been very conscious of the risk. Indeed, now there is a plaque in the Foreign Office commemorating the names of all those who have died in service. From the first one, that ambassador who was killed by the IRA in Dublin, to other colleagues, several colleagues of mine I've known who have been killed in India and places. And when I was in Saudi Arabia, last thing I had on my car was a diplomatic plate, because in Saudi Arabia, I was based on the Persian Gulf side in a very small town, and there were only just the 2 of us, 2 diplomats there, and I was damned if I was going to have a diplomatic plate on my car sitting outside the supermarket saying, "Put the bomb under this one." So I had just a normal, ordinary civilian plane. One was always conscious of the dangers. Khartoum, of course, we had the annual coup, and we knew what to do. Keep your head down. Don't just wait for it to pass over. We weren't the target, but when the shells and the bullets fly, they have no name on it. I think my most satisfying time was when I was Her Majesty's Consul in Moscow. This was how I got there in 81 through to 83, and of course was there during the crisis of 1983. As a consul, I was responsible for a wide range of activities, but most useful experiences were helping the widows of British tourists who had gone out on guided tours. They would set out from London. Most of these were tourists who just recently retired, certainly over their 50s and out of their 50s and 60s and so on. And they had basically come out from London on a bus, a 3-day journey to Moscow. And there they would be guided around Moscow, which the Soviet Union on a map looks exactly the same as Middlesex. Same shape, same everything, slightly larger. And it is difficult to conceive of the distances you walk in places like Moscow. The streets, the main avenues are 8-lane avenues. So just to cross, even on the subway, it's a good hike. And they were being rushed around these various sites around Moscow. Then that would be followed by a 3 to 4 hour flight down to the Black Sea. Again, same thing, 3 days down there. Then a flight up to Leningrad, now Petersburg, again. And the result was they were falling like flies. I had 19 of them die on me. The saddest part was having to go and deal with the widow, the weeping widow. Fortunately, my wife was an absolute treasure. She herself had been widowed before she married me, so she knew what it meant. So she would do the sympathy side, while I got on with the bureaucracy. Most of these widows had come out with their husbands on what we called a family passport. The minute that husband died, the passport died with him. They were sitting there in Soviet Union with no passport. So I had to go out and literally meet them and to give them prepare an emergency passport. But the best part, I had to take a photograph of her with a Polaroid. This is where my wife was absolutely invaluable, helping her over this hurdle. So that is what I do that. As I say, I did that 19 times. That is the reason why, eventually, the family passport was abolished. That was the reason. But I think the most distressing case I had, a British engineer had been working on the oil pipeline, which was then under construction from Siberia, and finally ended up in Germany. He had been working on it when it exploded. And he breathed in burning oil into his lungs. Absolutely horrendously injured. One of the blessings of the communist system was that everything was centralized. So when these tourists died in the Crimea or wherever, or this engineer out in Siberia, the Soviets brought the body back to Moscow where we could get on with the bureaucracy. Now, this engineer, obviously I notified the Foreign Office to notify the wife what had happened. They obviously had some money because she said, right, I'm hiring an air ambulance and I'm coming out to pick the body up. But unfortunately, this all happened at the same time as the Russian missile crisis of 1983 when they shot down a Korean airliner over Siberia. Mrs. Thatcher and President Reagan did not take this lightly, and they were determined to punish Soviet Union. And the least they did, to start with, was to impose a worldwide automatic ban on any flights going in and out of the Soviet Union. And that was applied by pretty well every non-communist airline. All of a sudden, we were isolated. The Soviets themselves were terrified. They were the ruling clique, the Politburo, all geriatrics, every one of them, were literally terrified, hiding out. The military on a hair trigger everywhere. And it was in the middle of this that this lady was hiring an air ambulance to come bombing in to pick up her husband. And I kept going back to the Foreign Office, for God's sake, keep her back, keep her back, keep her back. Wait until we get it cleared. We must get this flight pre-cleared. If we don't, and if they fly in, they'll be shot down. The Soviets are not going to take the risk. So this went on for about 3 or 4 days, and she was getting more and more agitated. Eventually she says, I'm bloody well coming anyway. So by this time, I'd done all the paperwork, etc., etc. The Soviets and I had both done all the formal stuff. And we planned, therefore, to meet at the airport, Sheremetyevo Airport, where they brought the body in an ambulance. Well, not the body, he was still alive. They brought the engineer to the airport in an ambulance. I was there, and unusually I was allowed out onto the tarmac, complete with KGB guard, complete with submachine gun, etc., etc. And the chap from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and so on. And we were waiting there, and the air ambulance came in about 2 o'clock in the morning. This was in November, pitch black, cold. And it came in, started taxi up to where we were, and I went into the ambulance, and he died in my arms. So I got out the ambulance, went over up to the steps of the air ambulance to meet the now widow, to tell her that she was a widow. She obviously was distraught, and all she wanted was to get the body and take it home. But we had a problem. He died in the Soviet Union, and there are formalities to go through, cause of death, etc., and so on and so forth. And she was having none of it. So myself and the chap from the MFA and the KGB got our heads together, and I said, look, didn't he die on the air ambulance? So the two, the pilot and the doctor on the air ambulance, were not over the moon about this, but they were persuaded. So they loaded him on the airplane, on the air ambulance, and off it took. And we returned. I went back home, several stiff whiskies. That was one of the last jobs I did in Moscow. So the official version at the end of it all was that this poor engineer died on a Swiss aeroplane. So presumably he today will have a Swiss death certificate. It wasn't all gloom and doom though. I recall right at the beginning of my posting to Moscow as Her Majesty's Consul, I went to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to present my credentials, and I was met by 3 very Soviet bureaucrats, absolutely typically of the Russians that Giles used to draw in his cartoons. And they were sitting behind this desk with big wide grins on their faces, saying, "Ah, Mr. Bond, we have been expecting you." So I presented my credentials. Next task was to get a Soviet registration number plate for my car. The way the diplomatic plates were registered with the various embassies was D for diplomatic, and then a number which signified the embassy. The British embassy was number 1, much to the disgust of the American embassy, which was only 04. But we got 01 because we recognised the Soviet regime before they did. So there it was, D01, And at the end of it all, 007. Don't say the Soviets did not have a sense of humour.
Steve, what a way to finish! What a way to finish chatting this afternoon here at home. It's hard to believe, excuse the pun, but Bond with an E, 007 on his number plate was driving around Moscow.
Absolutely.
Dare I ask what the car was?
It was a Ford Cortina.
So a Ford Cortina with the number plate 007 on diplomatic plates, driven by Bond with an E, going round Moscow.
Absolutely.
Steve, would you have ever seen yourself as a full-time military man and in a full-time career out of the military and staying in the army?
No, I think I'd be too independent for that. Obviously, we did what we were told in the diplomatic service. It is a service, and you went where they sent you, but you had an element of choice. And I don't think I would, which is why I never really went for the army in the first place. It's just a regime, and you just have to do what you're told, and that's that. No argument. You could argue a case in the Foreign Office. Having said that, I will. When he grows up, my grandson is 8 years old at the moment, full of life and ambition and adventure and bounce and everything else. If I'm still around, I will very much encourage him to join the army or the services, if only on sort of 5-year tour, in order to get a good trade skill out of it, rather than going to university, spending 2 to 3 years university, racking up massive costs and debts and everything else. Why not get paid? Army credentials are recognised widely or by all the trade unions. Their training is as good as anybody's. Indeed, 60 years on, I can still strip a rifle down to its constituent parts in Russian. That's how good army training is. 60 years I have rarely ever used military vocabulary in the years since, but I can still strip a rifle down from the foresight, rear sight, trigger, you name it. I know all the Russian words for that. That's how good army training is, and I would recommend that certainly for my grandson, maybe my granddaughter.
Before we close, I want to extend my sincere thanks to Steve for sharing his time and his story. It's truly inspirational to hear how a young lad growing up in World War II East Yorkshire went on to lead such an extraordinary life, both during his national service and later with a full career in the Foreign Office. And to our listeners, thank you for joining us and listening to Steve's remarkable journey. If this episode resonated with you, I invite you to explore more episodes from Veterans Voices UK, where we will continue to share the stories of those who answered the call and served. Remember, these stories are more than just history, they're a living legacy. By subscribing, listening and sharing a podcast, you're helping keep their voices alive and ensuring that our veterans and their experiences are never forgotten. So please subscribe to Veterans Voices UK on your favourite podcast platform. Leave a review and share this episode with others who may appreciate Steve's story. And don't forget to visit the website at www.veteransvoices.uk to learn how you can get involved in future episodes. Thank you for being part of our community, and we look forward to having you with us for the next episode. Until then, I'm Matt Lim, and this has been Veterans Voices UK.